For the longest time in both singles and doubles, there's been one kind of Pokémon stalling out every game and ruining your day: the bulky water type. If you think about it, water is built for defense. Only 2 weaknesses, 4 resistances, and with the right secondary typing, it can tank anything. But in Gen 9, they are almost gone. Alomomola, Primarina, and Dondozo. That's it. Together they are only in 18% of teams. Compare that to Gen 7 where Toxapex alone was in 30% of teams, and you are going to ask, what the furret happened to Bulky Waters? I picked Bulky Waters for this video because they really show how much the last 2 generations changed the game. Keep in mind, I don't think all these changes are bad. Bulky Waters were indeed broken, which is why Toxapex was everywhere to begin with. But why exactly were they broken? It all started in Gen 3. Back then, all rock, steel and ground moves were physical, and in a meta dominated by monsters like Tyranitar, Metagross, Aerodactyl and Flygon, one Pokémon rose up to be the ultimate wall: Swampert, the father of the bulky water. Ground water is an amazing combination. It can resist steel, rock and ground, and it has only one weakness in grass. Not to mention, Gen 3 was all about Sandstorm and Swampert was immune. Swampert could tank the 4 most common offensive Pokémon in the meta, and it could often destroy them back with Earthquake, Surf or even Ice Beam. Many Pokémon ran Hidden Power Grass just to deal with Swampert. Suicune and Milotic were good of course, but Swampert was the first bulky water to dominate a metagame. Sure, Swampert was good because of the janky Gen 3 mechanics, but you would think after the physical and special split in Gen 4, bulky waters would not work anymore. They actually became more common. Swampert was still a thing of course because of the sand, but if you look at the most common offensive mons in Gen 4, they are Tyranitar, Dragonite, Metagross, Heatran, Infernape, and how could we forget, no matter how much we try to forget, Jirachi. Water type resisted most offensive Pokémon in DPP. Empoleon, Starmie, Vaporeon, Milotic, Suicune, they were at least 8 bulky waters in Gen 4 OU. Even weird stuff like tanky Gyarados wasn't uncommon back then. Bulky waters were a staple in Gen 4 not because they were broken necessarily, but because the most common offensive Pokémon did not have the tools to break them. Of course, the bulky water started getting broken and annoying in Gen 5. Gen 5 had permanent rain. Of course water is gonna be broken in permanent rain. Even trash Pokémon like Tentacruel were top tier in that meta. Because rain was everywhere, a water resist was mandatory for every team. Some bulky waters saw play for no other reason that they could counter other water types, like Gastrodon, who was immune to water and it could go in sand and rain teams. However, 2 features in Gen 5 made bulky waters broken for generations to come: Regenerator and Scald. Regenerator is rather simple. It's an ability that heals a third of a Pokémon's HP when they switch out. The first real Pokémon to do this was Slowking. You could switch into Slowking, wall the hit and switch out and boom, it was healed all the way full again. Few things are more annoying than dealing with a Regenerator pivot. The second thing, and also something that Slowking had, was Scald. Scald doesn't even sound that good. It is an 80 power water move with a 30% chance to burn. That's basically Flamethrower, right? Well, actually no, Flamethrower is only 10%. And unlike Flamethrower, you cannot switch into a fire type to tank a Scald. Even from a wall with very little special attack, Scald might as well be a one-hit KO because Burns cut your attack in half. And Burns did 12.5% damage per turn back then. That's double leftovers. Scald does decent damage, and even if you resist water, it burns, and that sucks. Scald had no switching and honestly no counterplay. You could resist the burn or you could resist the water damage, but you couldn't do both. Any bulky water that could learn Scald was automatically way more useful because of it. Even Pokémon that could run Toxic preferred Scald because at least it could also hit Steel and Poison types. To say Scald was a hated move in competitive would be a bit of an understatement. Scald was the main reason Bulky Waters stayed relevant in Generation 6. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot of fire damage in the meta with Charizard Y, Talonflame and Heatran, and of course with the introduction of Fairy types, Steel attacks were a lot more common, and Water does indeed resist Steel. But there were also a lot of walls of different types. However, those walls do not have Scald. Slowbro became even better than Slowking because it could tank Mega Metagross and Mega Lopunny, and it could scald them until they got burned. Slowbro was really good, but it wasn't a centralizing force in the meta. That would all change, however, in Generation 7, and all for a single Pokémon, Toxapex. Toxapex had an insane 152 base defense to compete with Slowbro, but it also had pretty much anything you would want in a wall. It had Regenerator and it could run Scald, Toxic, Toxic Spikes, Haze, and Baneful Bunker, which is basically Protect with damage on it. On top of that, for Arceus knows what reason, it had Recover too. Toxapex was tankier than your mom in a bicycle, it wasn't weak to grass, it could pivot in and out to heal all the damage you did to it, and it could break walls with either Scald or Toxic, and it could even shut down setup sweepers with Haze. It could do anything, it was killed by nothing, and because of that, it was everywhere. Not that the other Scald spammers in the meta weren't annoying too, but Toxapex set a new standard for the bulky water archetype. By the time we get to Gen 8, bulky waters start falling off. Gen 8 removed Megas and half the national dex, and introduced a lot of headaches for the bulky waters. Utility Pokémon had their move pool gutted, with lots of Pokémon losing Toxic and Defog. There were new physical Pokémon like Rillaboom, which had enough damage to destroy water types. Bulky waters could build to tank Rillaboom, or they could build to tank the many special attackers, but they couldn't do both. And that's important because up until Gen 8, bulky waters were almost universal. Now they needed other complementary walls to tank the things they could tank alone before. Lots of bulky waters actually had mediocre stats, and they kinda coasted on good abilities or a complete diverse move pool, and now, in Gen 8, there was way too much damage in the meta for those Pokémon to work. Of course, that doesn't mean that bulky waters were bad in Gen 8. Slowking was a huge abuser of the new teleport pivot move, and Toxapex was still very relevant, but they couldn't tank everything, and they didn't just work on any team. Generation 9 was the last nail in the coffin for the bulky water. The main reason is actually a change that was celebrated by the competitive community. They finally got rid of Scald. Well, not quite. Scald does exist in Gen 9, but it is not everywhere anymore. Over the last 2 years, Scald was given to many other Pokémon, but Game Freak for once showed a lot of restraint on what Pokémon gets Scald. For the most part, Scald only went to Pokémon that suck. And most of the decent Pokémon that did get Scald, they are more offensive Pokémon like Walking Wake, who don't even like Scald anyway. Pretty much every relevant bulky water lost it except for Alomomola, and of course Alomomola doesn't even take it half the time. To be honest, Scald was keeping the bulky water on life support for the last generation, and without it, a lot of Pokémon just do not work anymore. Why would you take a Gastrodon over a Galarian Slowking? Or why would you take a Toxapex over a Galarian Slowking? Or why would you take a Quagsire over a Galarian Slowking? Okay, you get it. Glowking is also a problem. It is single-handedly driving a lot of bulky waters out of business. That's a great way to look at the problem though, because it wasn't only power creeping damage that made bulky waters less relevant, it was also power creeping defense. You have things like Glowking, Garganacl, Hatterene, Pekarond, Wisingalar, Tinglu, Clefable. You have a lot of really good options that can tank just as much, and usually they have better utility on top of that. Hell, all those Pokémon I just mentioned, except for Tinglu, are all immune to Toxic. Even though we have some really good bulky waters in Gen 9, you really need a good reason to take a bulky water over Glowking. Even Dondoso, a Pokémon that by previous generation standards would have been a Mewtwo tier broken Pokémon, is only seen on stall. If you really need a physical wall that can do good damage, you can take Great Tusk, Iron Threads, bulky Scissor Sets or Garganacl. Dondoso is far too exploitable to function on its own, like the other walls can. With so many options, you simply don't pick Dondoso. Sure, with a proper support and a complementary defensive coverage, Dondoso can be really good, but that's also why it is barely common enough to be in OU in the first place. Speaking of complementary, in this meta, bulky waters are also redundant. Walking Wake, Samurott Hisui, and Ogerpon Wellspring together are in 43% of teams. Water coverage is very valuable in this meta, and about half the players in OU are taking some type of offensive water, so defensive water types are a lot harder to justify. Ironically, I do think banning Ogerpon Wellspring would make bulky waters a lot more popular. I mean, can you imagine a world without Ogerpon Wellspring? The last bulky water that managed to stay in this generation's OU was Primarina, although honestly, I don't think calling Primarina a bulky water is fair. Primarina is a bulky fairy that just happens to be water type. Don't get me wrong, Primarina certainly appreciates being a water type, it takes neutral damage from steel because of that, and that's a big deal, but I don't believe that Primarina would be much worse if it was, say, Fairy Ground or Fairy Steel or something. It can do a lot of utility roles very well, which is how it barely scraped its way into OU with 5.2%, but it is neither a universal pick or particularly strong compared to all the other bulky Pokémon in the meta. Altogether, these bulky waters barely show up in 18% of teams, and they are all situational, even in stall. Yes, sure, we have 3 water types in OU that build bulky, but is it even an archetype anymore? Alomomola is a pivot, Primarina is a special bruiser and setup sweeper and a support in general, and Dondoso is a traditional wall that usually takes something like Course. All of them fit in different teams for different reasons, and they have very little in common outside from being water types. I say this because coming back to the game from Gen 7, I started looking into every Pokemon in the meta, and when you talk about these 3 bulky water types, people don't go so and so is a bulky water anymore. Bulky waters lost their class consciousness, folks. Jokes aside, I don't think this is a bad thing. If I am being honest, bulky waters were only a thing in the past because broken elements kept them relevant. Swampert wouldn't dominate Gen 3 if all rock and steel moves were physical. Toxapex wouldn't be in 33% of teams in Gen 7 if it had a reasonable move pool, and none of them would have stayed relevant in Gen 8 if it wasn't for Scald. Do we really wanna go back to those times? For what? Sure, stall isn't as good as it used to be, but you could argue it's never been a better time to be a wall. We have utility walls, we have offensive walls, we have pivot walls, and whatever the Heliolisk you wanna call Clefable, we got that thing too. To me, as a player, that's way more interesting than just slapping Toxapex on it and calling it a day. In the words of Martin Luther Slowking, if you do not miss bulky waters, you don't have a heart. But if you want them back, you ain't got a brain. And you got neither a heart or a brain if you don't subscribe, leave a like and hit the bell right now, you son of a B-sharp.